field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street singing songs and they carrying signs, mostly saying hooray for our side. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. Young people speak in their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop the children. What's that sound? Everybody looks, it's going down.
Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner with The Robust Opposition. My guest tonight is Graham Steele of Stanford Business School. How you doing, Graham?
I'm good, Lauren. How are you?
Graham and I had discussed whether or not we should even do the show in light of the George Floyd protests. And I said, well, you know what? When you think about it, there is some real looting that's going on, not the looting that the mainstream media is making a big stink about. Graham Steele is the director of the Corporations and Society Initiative at Stanford Graduate School of Business. Prior to joining Stanford, Graham was a member of the staff of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. From 2015 to 2017, Graham was the Minority Chief Counsel for the Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. From 2010 to 2015, he was a legislative assistant for United States Senator Sherrod Brown from Ohio, handling the senator's work as a member of the Senate Banking Committee. He also spent 4 years as the staff director of the Subcommittee on Financial Institutions and Consumer Protection. Prior to joining Senator Brown's staff, Graham was a policy counsel at Public Citizens Congress Watch in Washington, D.C. What has been your reaction to this George Floyd thing, and how have you demonstrated your reaction?
Sure. And again, thanks for having me. And we should say his name, George Floyd, of course, but there's also Breonna Taylor. There was Ahmaud Arbery before that. It feels like every few weeks or months, there's a different name that we have to say for someone who has been the victim of a police killing. And it's just time for that to end. And I mean, the way that I acted most recently was there was an organized movement in downtown Oakland today, where I live in the city of Oakland. And so I went out with my partner. We just joined people and we marched from the port there over to the Lake Merritt, and back to downtown, and just showed up in solidarity for all the Black and brown people out there who are suffering from state-sponsored violence. So that's been the way I've been trying to do it. I've been weirdly, for me, trying to stay off social media this weekend, but trying to be present in my own community here in Oakland.
Last night when I was watching TV and I saw that there was something going on about 5 minutes from me in downtown Beverly Hills, I just felt compelled to go out and cover it. And I was right there in between the line of the protesters who were facing off against the police. And I didn't really witness any violence or looting myself. I was there from about 7 o'clock to 8 p.m. But after I left, apparently the Alexander McQueen store was broken into and a lot of people were stealing things. And, you know, the mainstream corporate media was making a big deal about this looting. And they were being very careful to say that, you know, these were not the main protesters. The main protesters were peaceful, but there were these elements that were ruining it. And one of my friends, who's a mainstream media anchor person, actually, he described them today on Twitter as bad people and thugs. And I was like, oh my God, how can you say that? I mean, these are my reaction to this is a demonstration of hopelessness and helplessness after generations of inaction on racial injustice, in my opinion. You know, I moved here in 1987, and in 1992, we had the civil unrest, and I've been very careful to call it the civil unrest and not riots, because I feel like that's what happened. You know, after the Watts riots in 1965, everybody said things were going to change in the inner city, and they never changed. There was no investment in the inner city. There was still a lot of poverty, a lot of drugs, a lot of inequities. And then in 1992, you could see Rodney King get beaten on videotape by these white officers mercilessly. And then when he was completely acquitted by an all-white jury in Simi Valley, which is where a lot of cops live, the reaction happened. And really nothing has changed since, 1992 in these communities either. So I wanted to start out by reading a quote from James Baldwin. He was asked in an Esquire magazine interview in 1968, how would you define someone who smashes in the window of a television store and takes what he wants? And so this is similar to what we're looking at today. And James Baldwin said, before I get to that, how would you define somebody who puts a cat where he is and takes all the money out of the ghetto where he makes it? Who is looting whom? Grabbing off the TV set? He doesn't really want the TV set. He's saying, screw you. It's just judgment, by the way, on the value of the TV set. He doesn't want it. He wants to let you know he's there. The question I'm trying to raise is a very serious question. The mass media, television, and all the major news agencies endlessly use that word looter. On television, you always see black hands reaching in, And so the American public concludes that these savages are trying to steal everything from us, and no one has seriously tried to get where the trouble is. After all, you're accusing a captive population who has been robbed of everything of looting. I think it's obscene. So before I get to my question, what do you think of that quote, Graham?
Well, I think that's right. It's so resonant right now, and I think of at this march that I was just at, there was a young 24-year-old man who stood up on the back of a truck with a PA system, and he said, "What we are doing here is crying out. We've tried every other way of getting the system's attention, and people are not hearing us. They're not listening to us. That hasn't worked. Now we're trying something different." And so I think that is the cry we're hearing from a lot of people right now, is that the system is not working for them. They feel like it's rigged. And so they're taking a different kind of action, the only action that they know how in this particular moment. And so people think that it's somehow about the property. It's not about the property. And the looting narrative distracts away from what really happened here, which is the police killed a man. That is what this ought to be about, is about that man's life. And talking about the value of a few broken windows or a few handbags stolen sort of tells you a little bit about the priorities if the media covers the two things as if they're in some way equal. So I really want people to focus on what happened here, which is a man lost his life in Minneapolis. And that is what we ought to be concerned about, not a few broken windows.
Exactly. I want to ask you if you think banks, billionaires, hedge funds, private equity firms, what they do can be described as organized looting, in the same way that they're describing the looting that we're seeing here in LA anyway as organized. And do you think the government has adequately protected the people from this looting? And do you think the media has adequately framed what they do as looting?
Well, it reminds me of an old lyric from a Woody Guthrie song about some men rob you with a six-gun, others rob you with a fountain pen. There are different ways of people siphoning off things that are valuable to other people. And the crash of 2008 was one way that we saw looting happen, of executives paying themselves bonuses out, getting bailed out, and then taking homeowners' homes from them. We're seeing it, frankly, right now with the COVID-19 crisis, with some of these hospitals that are owned by private equity firms that have paid themselves large bonuses, that have stripped out management fees there. The hospitals are left as skeletons of their former selves, and it's no wonder that people can't get good health care in those places. It is a legalized form of looting. And there's even, frankly, an economics term. A Nobel laureate actually coined that term, of this way of bankers going in, stripping all the assets and stripping all the income out of a company, and then leaving it to fail, leaving someone else to clean it up for them. And so there are many ways in which supercharged Wall Street capitalism is a form of looting, yes.
Okay, and the media certainly never they never use the word looting when they talk about what Wall Street does. I've noticed.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think that, CEOs are viewed as pillars of their community and get to establish charitable foundations using the money that they've looted out of communities and get to make themselves look good and try to do things like greenwashing to try to lift up their profiles. Whereas folks out in the street protesting racial injustice are viewed very differently by the media. So it definitely seems that there's a double standard between the two.
Now, I want to talk about the Federal Reserve, because you worked for the Federal Reserve, you worked for the banking committees, you're teaching about it now, you know everything there is to know about the Federal Reserve, and I want to get into the history of it. We didn't start out with a central bank, we started out with public banks. But before we get into that, I want to talk about what happened in 2008. So you wrote an article called Rethinking the Fed. You wrote, in fact, the leaders of a public institution that holds itself out as apolitical make political choices all the time. They just cloak them in neutral, market-friendly language, pontificating about inequality without using the full force of the tools they have to fight this problem is a choice. So I want you to talk about the different choices that the Federal Reserve has, which way they decided to go, and how that has impacted communities of color. And specifically talk about the financial collapse, because 47% of African Americans and 53% of Latinos had zero net worth after that incident because all their equity was in their homes. So talk about what led up to that situation.
Sure, yeah. The most notable example of a way in which the Fed made a choice leading up to the financial crisis that impacted low-income communities, communities of color, was that a lot of community groups and activists went to them in the years prior to 2008 and said, there's predatory lending happening in our communities. And Federal Reserve, you as the most powerful regulator of all of these Wall Street lenders, there's something you can do about it. There are people coming in, they're doing subprime loans here, they're stripping the value out of these homes. We want you to do something. And the economists at the Federal Reserve said to them, these are just stories, these are anecdotes. Bring us some real data that we view as acceptable to us, and maybe we'll do something. And they didn't. They waited. And what do you know? The entire edifice of a financial system built on those subprime mortgages came crashing down in 2008. And then who bore the brunt of that financial crisis? It was those very same communities, because then the foreclosure started because those mortgages were unsustainable. And who lost their homes as a result of those foreclosures? It was mostly concentrated in low-income communities and communities of color. So there's a way in which the decision not to crack down on Wall Street banks and their predatory lending led directly to this crash. In the way that the aftermath of the crash, the Federal Reserve did not step in, did not require its banks to work with homeowners to actually keep them in their homes. Instead, the banks came in and took their homes away from them. Then there are a whole host of other ways in which the Federal Reserve has influenced our economy. They operate the payment system where banks send money to one another. And if they could settle those payments more quickly, people would have access to their money faster, and they wouldn't be charged overdraft fees by their banks and then get pushed out of their institutions. But the Fed has dragged its feet on that project as well. They could make payment settlement happen faster, but they haven't done that. So they have a whole bunch of different tools that they choose to operate in a way that actually harms the most marginalized in our communities.
And also, they weren't held accountable. I mean, specifically, I'm thinking of that guy, John Paulson, the hedge fund guy, who told Goldman Sachs to create that fund. I think it was called the Abacus Fund. And he told them to put all their shittiest mortgages in there, the ones where people had no chance of paying them back. He bet against that fund. He shorted that fund. And yet Goldman Sachs sold that to all sorts of pension funds who holds teachers' pensions and public workers' pensions. And I think that the fine for that was just a slap on the wrist. Am I right?
I think that's right. And I think that's to get back to your point earlier about looting, that's an example of taking both millions of homes away from people with the predatory lending that was in the mortgages that were then securitized and sold off to investors who then themselves lost millions of dollars. So you have homeowners being hurt by that. You have investors like pension funds, retirees getting hurt by that. And not one CEO went to jail after the financial crisis. And that's, again, another choice by our elected officials, by the people in government, not to hold those people accountable.
Yes. Now let's get back to the Federal Reserve and what it even is. Thomas Jefferson, who was one of the founders of our country, said, if the American people ever allow private banks to control the issuance of their currencies, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all their prosperity until their children will wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. And that's pretty prescient, I would say, considering our homeless situation here in Los Angeles and in the country. So can you talk about the role of the central bank in US history? Specifically how the colonies first had public banks and then how the central bank evolved, various points in history, how they tried to do away with it.
But yeah, exactly. The colonies had public financial institutions. When then the United States was formed, Alexander Hamilton, folks who have seen the musical, I have not seen the musical, might be aware that he wanted to form a public bank run out of Washington, D.C., and there was the first Bank of the United States. And there was this push and pull between the Federalists who believed in a strong, robust central government and the folks like Thomas Jefferson, who you just quoted, who were agrarians. They were slaveholders too. And they believed in decentralized power and an agricultural-based economy. And there was this push and pull. They ultimately formed the first Bank of the United States. Its charter expired eventually in the 1800s. And then Andrew Jackson was president. And he fought and he fought and he fought against the Second Bank of the United States. It was not rechartered. It was not reauthorized. And so we had a system of private banking for a period of time where it was state-based and private institutions issued their own currency. Well, what happened was exactly as Jefferson said. There were booms and there were busts, there were failures. There were concerns that people's money wasn't going to be worth what the banks said it was. It was a very unstable system for a period of years until the 1860s. There was one national regulator established called the Controller of the Currency that was the federal regulator of banks. And it literally controlled the currency to make sure that all banks were issuing good notes on behalf of the United States. It didn't solve all the problems. There was another banking panic in 1907. And after that, in 1913, is when the Federal Reserve was formed. And the point of the Fed was supposed to be to put a floor under our monetary system, to control it so there weren't these booms and busts. There wasn't this privately created money competing with publicly created money. And people knew that the banking system was stable. Well, I mean, it didn't last forever because then we had another panic in 1929 in that stock market crash. And they formed things like the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation that insures all bank accounts. But it's been this push and pull over our history over private institutions wanted to create money and profit off of the creation of money and the growth of finance. And in theory, the federal government is supposed to be pushing back on that, trying to control it, trying to maintain stability so there's growth throughout our economy. And yeah, the Federal Reserve has not always been the same way over the course of years. It has played a larger role in people's lives sometimes. It helped finance wars back in the day, and it had to strike an accord with the Treasury Department that it would not engage in fiscal policy making. There have been different reserve banks located throughout the country. The Treasury Secretary in the control of the currency used to be the head of the Federal Reserve. Now it's an independent chairman, Jerome Powell. And in the 1970s, the Federal Reserve was given two mandates for the monetary policy work that it does. They're supposed to be to maximize employment and ensure that prices are stable. And then we got to 2008 when the Federal Reserve in its banking capacity had let the private sector run wild, and it had to backstop the entire system. It had to basically bail out all of Wall Street. And so that's where we are now, is it got hemmed in a little bit in 2010 in some of the Wall Street reform laws. But now we see that with COVID-19 happening again, the Federal Reserve is once again pumping money into the financial system to largely prop up large companies and the banking system that backs them.
I remember arguing with a friend of mine at the time about whether them bailing out the banks was necessary. Because, first they let Lehman Brothers go, and that created all sorts of problems. So then they decided to step in and bail out all the rest of them, Bear Stearns. But I remember, thinking like they don't have to pay, like with AIG, that big insurance company, they gave Goldman Sachs like 100 cents on the dollar. They could have given them 50 cents on the dollar. They didn't have to make all these banks whole. So can you also talk about how back then, what could have been done differently that would have helped people more than these banks and these corporations?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of the times the conversations about bailouts devolve into a binary choice of, are we going to bail them out or not? Yes or no, and not, if we give these institutions money, can we require that they use it in a particular way? Or if we as taxpayers are going to invest money in these institutions, should we control them in some way? There are a whole host of ways in which we can help support the financial system while also penalize executives for running their institutions into the ground, fire them, wipe out certain shareholders if institutions get support, require that institutions actually support things like homeowners. Like if you take a bailout, you have to actually keep people in their homes, write down the value of their mortgages so they're not trapped and burdened with debt and lose their homes. There are a whole host of other ways you could structure these kinds of programs that could actually help workers, that could help homeowners, that wouldn't enrich executives and shareholders, and that would ensure there's accountability for the executives that got these institutions into trouble in the first place. So, as you said, there may have been a need to help support some institutions, but there are also some institutions that could not have survived but for that support. And the government didn't really try to drive as hard a bargain with them as I would have liked to have seen, in terms of holding executives accountable, in terms of making sure that real people were actually helped when the money went to Wall Street. And frankly, we didn't give money directly to Main Street either at that time. That's a way in which this current crisis is a little bit different, but still, it's a recurring theme that Wall Street, big banks get help and real people don't.
You wrote in your article, rather than what it was meant to be, a lender of last resort, the central bank is effectively our nation's policymaker of last resort, outsourcing more and more authority to central bankers to solve our structural economic problems is a convenient device for a polarized Congress that can't seem to meet the basic needs of its constituents. Now, you have worked for Congress, specifically staffing that banking committee. Talk about what you observed. Have you seen members of Congress ever try to rein in the Fed or Wall Street for that matter? And do you think, excuse me, do you think the reason they have ceded control to the Fed is that they don't have the sufficient technical knowledge to oversee them? Or like with other things, it's a matter of lobbying and campaign contributions by the industry?
I have seen members over the years try to actually do something to rein in Wall Street. I mean, one of the first things that I worked on when I got into the Senate with my former boss was an amendment to cap the size of the largest banks to effectively break up the largest 4 to 6 banks in our country. You know, there were pushes back in 2009, 2010 to tax banker bonuses and take that money back. I would say that is where the lobbying and campaign contributions came into play, because even with all of the animus towards Wall Street following a massive crisis in a Great Recession, there was not the will in Congress at the time to actually pass either one of those measures and kind of put in place the reforms that we needed at that time to really restructure Wall Street and understand that because its political power comes from its financial power. It controls so many financial resources, and that's why it has so much influence over members of Congress. So that's what I saw up close. I think it's less that they don't understand. I think it's more that it is easier to delegate to somebody else. When you have two parties that are at a point of such dysfunction, they're at loggerheads over workers ought to be helped out or shareholders ought to be helped out. It's easier to break that impasse by just saying, we'll just give money to the Fed. It's a quote unquote neutral arbiter of what should happen. and we'll let it decide who gets funding and who doesn't. But the point I was trying to make in my article is that the Fed operates in a certain way. It buys certain kinds of financial assets, and it doesn't like putting strings, as we are seeing right now. It doesn't like putting strings on that money, like that you have to retain workers, that you have to stop paying dividends and buybacks, that you have to limit executive bonuses. You're not going to get those kinds of meaningful strings attached when you give the Fed this money. And so what I wanted to instill in members of Congress is that it is not the right institution to be making some of these decisions. And it is not a substitute for having that fight with your colleagues in Congress over who really ought to be helped by this aid package. So it might seem like a convenient way to appropriate money, as we'll just give it to the Fed and somebody else will figure it out. But when they do that, there are consequences to it.
You know, I had Pramila Jayapal on my show the other day, and I asked her a very specific question, being that she's the head of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. You know, if she thought that Congress should have more control over the Fed, or at least oversee them better. And she totally dodged the question. I mean, part of it was she didn't know I was going to ask her that question, and she was prepared to talk about something else. But also, I kind of got the impression she just really hadn't thought about it before, because like you said, it's something that they've outsourced to the Fed. And like you also just said, there are no strings attached. I mean, we've read that companies like Boeing, for instance, didn't even touch the bailout money because they want to furlough their people. So they were able to go to the capital markets instead. I wanted to talk about Dodd-Frank a little bit before we talk about what the Fed just did. So I want to go back in, chronological order. Because I remember that what you were talking about, what your boss, Sherrod Brown, tried to do. It was the Brown-Kaufman Amendment, along with Ted Kaufman from Delaware, who took over Joe Biden's seat. And I remember following that in very closely as that was going through Congress. And I remember hearing that had Obama supported it, it might have happened. And Obama really was the one, if you read 13 Bankers by Simon Johnson, who is no progressive by any means. I mean, he was the head of the International Monetary Fund once, right? The head of it, or just had
the chief economist.
Okay, the chief economist. So, the International Monetary Fund is a very neoliberal organization. It's not like a progressive one. And even he said that, they have these 13 bankers that got into the room with Obama because it wasn't enough for them that George Bush was going to bail them out. They needed to see from the incoming president that he was going to be supportive of that. And they all said in interviews afterwards that they were expecting to be broken up. They were expecting to have the Glass-Steagall reinstated, the separation between commercial and investment banking, and none of that happened. Talk about the Dodd-Frank reform and why that was weak tea, and also how, as soon as it got put into place because of regulatory capture of the agencies, it was weakened or even not implemented.
I think to get back to something you just said, finance is hard for a lot of members of Congress because bankers come in and speak in this sort of esoteric jargon. And I think a lot of people, frankly, a lot of congressional staff that are supposed to be specialists, a lot of members, I think a lot of people in the public get intimidated when, a banker comes in and starts talking about leverage or this credit default swap or that collateralized debt obligation, and they kind of shut down and they just sort of nod their head and try to end the conversation as quickly as I can. And I think that's how industry ends up dominating a lot of those conversations, is making members think that they are out of their depth if they try to understand it. And so it becomes this insider conversation where the industry gets to dominate the whole thing. And I think demystifying it is really important so that we all understand how this system works, and so that industry doesn't get to have an outsized seat at the table, and so that members understand how important these issues that seem really abstract and really esoteric can affect people's lives in a really fundamental way. And I think that was the thing that Dodd-Frank suffered from, was you had regulators coming in and industry coming in and saying, don't do anything big, don't do anything bold, don't do anything structural to us, because it'll cause the system to collapse, and it's still very weak because don't forget we just crashed it. And also, it'll be bad for the real economy if my bank is smaller, or if I can't do this kind of high-flying proprietary trading stuff. Then that'll be bad for workers on Main Street. That's another tactic, is to sort of say this won't benefit me, the banker on Wall Street. It actually benefits workers on Main Street, even though that's usually not the case. And so that's the way the law was structured, was let's just give the same agencies that had failed leading up to the financial crisis, let's just give them more authority this time. Let's wag our fingers at them and tell them to just do a little bit better this time. And this time will be different. And what we saw in the aftermath of the law passing was that it took a decade for a lot of the rules to be written. When they did get written, they weren't particularly strong. And then the Trump administration came in 2017. And even though he campaigned as a populist and campaigned as an anti-Wall Street candidate, all the people he put in at those agencies came straight out of industry, and they've been doing death by 1,000 cuts to the Wall Street reform law, repealing this rule here, weakening it there, and sort of undoing the whole edifice of the reforms that had been written back in 2010.
Yes. It's so funny how he's governing a completely different way than he campaigned. And I think most of his base just don't understand that because, like you say, it's very complicated. And the Republican Party is doing nothing to stop him. Even the Never Trumpers are behind him now because he's doing all the business-friendly policies that Republicans typically like. Talking about credit default swaps, collateralized debt obligations, I had to teach myself that. I read The Big Short, I watched the movie, I was trying to figure out what was going on here. And it's about the financialization of our economy. All these securities, these financial products, this casino capitalism, it's very different from what Wall Street was originally designed to do. I mean, Wall Street was a place, and these investment banks were places where you could go if you wanted to start a business and you wanted to, get money to build plants and hire workers. And it's not like that anymore. Can you talk about the evolution of Wall Street before we go on to talking about the CARES Act?
Sure, that's right. I mean, I think a lot of the way that people used to think about bankers, there was an old saying, the 363 rule, that bankers borrowed at 3% from the government. They lent it out to a business at 6%, and they were on the golf course by 3 p.m. because they didn't really have anything else to do after that. And that's the way, when the banking system is working well, it's supposed to be a boring function. They have a license from the government. They have the backing of the government. They have the license to essentially engage in a monetary function to help support businesses by giving them loans, by taking your deposits in and holding them at safekeeping and paying you a reasonable rate of return on that, and by helping companies that want to raise money in the capital markets by issuing securities. The problem is that boring business has a limited amount of return they can make on it. You can't make a whole, there's a limit to the bonus you can get if you're just borrowing at 3% and lending out at 6%. So a lot of the history of banking has been a way to figure out how to do those same activities, but do them with less regulation, do them using more borrowed money so you can amplify your returns, and paying yourself more fees and bonuses by doing those kinds of activities. And so that's what's happened over the years. I mean, that free banking period I talk about in the 1800s was like that. The period leading up to the Great Depression was exactly that. Banks borrowing money to buy stocks, and then the value of the stocks drop and they're unable to pay the loans back. It's this same cycle over and over again of when finance gets in the business of producing more finance, it gets out of control. It stops supporting the real economy. And that's when you have these booms and these crashes and you have these massive recessions.
So now with the CARES Act, what they did, you notice that there wasn't sufficient money for individuals. I mean, some people haven't even gotten that measly $1,200 check yet. The small business money got used up really quickly by a lot of large corporations. We're using loopholes to take that money. The unemployment insurance is all backed up because of the states. The Medicaid money people aren't getting because a lot of these Republican states didn't take the Medicaid expansion. I mean, it's a huge mess. 100,000 small businesses have closed and 42% of them are not expected to reopen. OpenTable did a survey. 25% of the restaurants that closed are not expected to reopen. We've got 14.7% of people unemployed, expected to go up to like 25% by the fall. And yet the stock market has rebounded. And this is all because of forgetting about the 2.5 trillion of the CARES Act that went to to help the people. There was another 4 to 6 trillion that went to the banks through the Fed. So can you talk about that and why that is benefiting Wall Street and the billionaires?
Sure, exactly. There was about $454 billion that was allocated for the Fed to just set up a whole bunch of programs to support the financial markets, essentially. And so that means that they can buy, what they've announced that they're going to do is they're going to buy corporate bonds. They're going to buy something called an exchange traded funds, which are these financial products, these investment products that buy corporate bonds, including some junk bonds, meaning companies that have been downgraded in their credit rating, and so they're a little bit riskier. They're buying things called collateralized loan obligations, which are securities issued by companies that have a lot of debt. But fundamentally, the money going to the Fed is largely to purchase financial assets. That's good for banks because they're the ones that help issue the financial assets, so they can make a lot of money off of that. They invest in the financial assets themselves, so they know that there's a buyer, the Federal Reserve, at the end of the day, if they need to unload them on somebody. And so really, that's largely what a central bank, the way that our modern central bank operates, is it buys financial assets. There is some lending that can happen there. The Fed is supposed to buy loans from mid-sized businesses. But even there, the Federal Reserve announced that it was going to open it up so that oil and gas companies could get access to it. So not only is it helping the financial industry by propping up all these financial assets, it has also said it's going to prop up fossil fuels, polluters that are driving a climate crisis that could eventually lead to extinction of life on the planet. So the point I was trying to make in my article is the Fed, just because the Fed has structured its support programs this way, doesn't mean they have to be done that way. That they could think about other creative ways to get money to real people, to let people open up bank accounts at the Fed, for example, so that then if we wanted those IRS checks to go out, it could come directly through the Federal Reserve to every person the next day, the minute the Fed credited their account, the same way the Fed credits all these other companies' accounts when it buys their assets. So that's what's really going on here, is the Fed has the capacity, to the tune of potentially up to trillions of dollars, to buy these financial assets that will go to support large corporations. And even the mere announcement that it's going to buy those assets also helps these companies, because the Fed is essentially saying to investors, if you want to unload these sometime, don't worry, we'll take the risk off your hands if it looks like it's getting too risky.
And see, nobody does that for the people. If you have a company that isn't doing well and you go bankrupt, or if you're an individual and, for whatever reason you gambled away your money, you go bankrupt, you're on the streets. They're never on the streets because they own the street. It's really outrageous. Can you talk about the role of Blackrock?
Sure. So BlackRock's one of the largest investment managers in the world. It's got about $7 trillion in assets that it manages. And it grew in size after the last financial crisis, when it bought up a bunch of other companies that were going out of business. And it controls vast swaths of wealth. It owns a greater than 5% stake in almost all of the S&P 500. It manages pension funds everywhere. It is the largest investor in fossil fuel companies that I just mentioned that are driving the climate crisis. And it is a sponsor of these things called exchange traded funds that I was just talking about. It's the largest sponsor of ETFs that the Federal Reserve is buying. So the Fed is essentially propping up these financial products that BlackRock offers. So investors have piled into those products. At the same time, there's a division of BlackRock that is running some of the Fed's corporate bailout programs for them, because the Fed says they're the only institution that has the technical expertise. So on one hand, they're managing a program that is purchasing financial assets, while on the other hand, the Fed is buying some of the financial assets that BlackRock issues. So it's getting significant amount of support from these Fed programs. It is so important that it is managing them, so it's essential to the functioning of our financial system right now. And what we saw after the Fed said it was going to buy a bunch of BlackRock's ETFs is that investors all piled in there because the Fed was effectively saying, these are safe, these are guaranteed by us, everyone come and put your money in these particular funds.
Yeah, I mean, this is really like the fox guarding the hen house. The fox is making money out of the hen house. I mean, this conflict of interest, this is real corruption. I mean, it's real corruption, and Congress should be doing something about this. I mean, you wrote an article in September of 2019 in the American Prospect called Overhaul the Business of Wall Street. And you laid out ways that Congress could reform Wall Street without passing any new laws. Can you discuss some of those ways?
Sure. One of the central premises of that article was that much as Dodd-Frank didn't make big structural change to the financial system at that time, those agencies that administer that law and that oversee Wall Street have a lot of authority that they could use that has just been sort of laying dormant everywhere. So you had mentioned Glass-Steagall earlier. There are ways in which those agencies can implement a version of that that says that banks should only be taking deposits and lending and limit the amount of speculative activities that they can do. That was one example. I also pointed out that much like the Brown-Kaufman amendment that we talked about earlier was there to put a cap on the size of banks, that there are ways we have seen, like with Wells Fargo, for example, the Federal Reserve told Wells Fargo, your size is now capped, you can't grow over a certain size because there's rampant account fraud in your bank. So the point that I was trying to make in that article was that all these agencies, whether it's the SEC overseeing private equity, whether it's the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau overseeing predatory lenders, a lot of these agencies have a lot of power to actually reshape the financial industry, make it work for people, and break all the concentrated wealth that is concentrated on Wall Street right now.
Why should the government be forced to borrow money from private banks and pay interest to them when the Treasury Department can just print money or create computer entries, as the case may be? Should we have like one national public bank? And in lieu of that, what about more state banks like the Bank of North Dakota? And specifically talk about Ellen Brown's article on how to use the CARES Act to get money to finance that. Ellen Brown being the author of the Public Bank Solution and the founder of the Public Banking Institute.
I think there is a role for a public central bank in our country, and I think the Federal Reserve can play a useful role. It's just not fulfilling that role right now in the way that it is run. And it's a weird system because there are private regional reserve banks, there's a public board in DC, and there's a weird public-private relationship throughout the entire Federal Reserve System. And then we have privatized the money function in our country as well. The way that the Fed controls the supply of money is through private banks that have been chartered. And there's been a lot of thinking lately with a lot of brilliant academics about the fact that private banks essentially are franchisees of the state. And so to my mind, it's less getting rid of the Federal Reserve as it is thinking more about seeing the banks that have the right to serve this monetary function as being part of the government. And when you do that and see them as public actors, it really makes you rethink what is possible in terms of how they are structured. And then it puts ideas like public banking on the table. We're both in California. There's a big, robust movement here of trying to set up public banks. There was legislation passed here to help municipalities do that. I think there's a lot of promise in that approach. It works really well in North Dakota. I think most of the challenges there are technical ones, but they should be surmountable. We ought to be able to solve them. And I think the calls for public banks are just a byproduct of the fact that people feel like the financial system isn't working for them. They want other options. They want a financial system that doesn't lend to large fossil fuel companies and destroy the planet. They want a financial system that doesn't redline their communities and loot, again, wealth out of low-income communities of color. That they want something structured differently. And so that's the way that I would go. is make the Federal Reserve System more public and more reflective of the public will. And then, yeah, something like public banking. And then on the specific question about what Ellen Brown wants to do, I'm not a municipal government expert, so I don't really know how municipal finances work too much. That has been, in the past, one of the largest operational challenges is how you actually capitalize the state bank up front. And that would be nice as one way to do it, because that would then be a long-term source of capital, not just a short-term bond issued by the government. It could keep paying dividends, both literal and figurative, to our communities. And it'd be a way to continue having local investment even beyond the period of the pandemic ending.
I said that we were going to end on a hopeful note, and that hopeful note is you talking about your students, because I've always been under the impression that ever since the 80s, when the movie Wall Street was made, and Gordon Gekko, who was the famous trader in that movie, said, "Greed is good." It was supposed to be a satire, but everybody took it seriously, and everybody wanted to be Gordon Gekko. And it's been said that some of the greatest, minds in our educational institutions, our brightest students, all want to go into finance, as opposed to the helping professions like teaching or social worker or nurse or anything like that. But you said that you're noticing a different type of student there in your program. Can you elaborate on that?
The first point I would make is that I hope that this pandemic is actually making a lot of business school students rethink what actual essential work is and what they want to do with their lives, and whether they want to go into finance versus something like healthcare or even public service. But in addition to that, this younger generation gives me a lot of hope, because I even before COVID-19 hit, I was meeting with a lot of students, even the students who were, for example, part of the finance club, who would come to me and say, I'm getting an education here, but all people are talking to me about is shareholder value. Or I worked in private equity, but all they wanted to do was make a lot of management fees there. And these students really, the younger generation of students, I think, are looking for more purpose out of their lives than just making a profit. I think, number one, the high cost of living in areas like the Bay Area where I live, that proposition of the paycheck they are going to get doesn't go as far now. And so they're rethinking what social purpose they want to have when they go into work. And again, I've, past and future financiers coming and sitting down with me and saying, I've been thinking a lot about it, and I really understand that where we direct our money, either where our public institutions direct our money, or when I go and work at a bank, who we decide to fund and who we give loans to is actually a statement of value, of our values and what we want to support. And that is not a value neutral thing to just give a loan to a private prison or a predatory for-profit college company. I'm making a statement when I say that I want my company to support those sorts of things. So I do think that this younger generation gives me hope that they will take a different attitude when they go into either private business or public service, that they'll see that broader social purpose, and they'll stay with them throughout their entire careers.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for being with me on the show today, Graham, in these troubling times. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Lauren. I really appreciate the conversation.
Yes. And I want to give people a preview of my upcoming show, which is going to be a question and answer session after a film. And the film is called The Long Shadow. And I have an event page, which I'll post in the comments, where you can watch this film for free for the next week. And it was produced by a friend of mine, Donald Goldmacher, who also produced a film called Heist, Who Stole the American Dream, which we screened during Occupy LA. And his producing partner, Francis Causey, who also directed it and wrote this film. And a little blurb about it is this: of all the divisions in America, none is as insidious and destructive as racism. In this powerful documentary, the filmmakers, both privileged daughters of the South who were haunted by their families' slave-owning pasts, passionately seek the hidden truth and the untold stories of how America, guided by the South's powerful political influence, steadily, deliberately, and at times secretly established white privilege in our institutions, laws, culture, and the economy. So that's going to be my show next week. I'm going to put the event page in there where you can find the link to watch the film at your own leisure. And then Wednesday at 6 p.m. Pacific time, 9 p.m. Eastern time, we're going to be discussing it with Francis and Donald. So until then, share this video and keep fighting.